Okay. Um, Hi. Really nice to be here. Kind of fun sitting down, actually, doing a talk. Gives it a bit more relaxed feel. My name is Alex, and this is my colleague Eric. Um, we've been doing a research project called Trust Mojo for the last year or so. Is that okay? Better? Okay. Cool. Thanks. Does that sound better? Yeah, we did a research project called Trust Mojo about trust in online social spaces, where we wanted to try and look at offline sociology and try and use as much knowledge from that and apply it in an online context. We spent 3 months in San Francisco. We're from Stockholm originally, just moved to Berlin a while back. Yeah, we spent 3 months in San Francisco talking to lots of companies there that are setting up new social spaces and websites. And so we'd like to talk a little bit about the research then that we've been doing. And we also, okay, sorry. Hello? um, yeah, some stuff as well that has been seen on our blog, trustmojo.com. So, people profiles and trust is kind of what we're going to talk about then. It's going to be mostly focused on trust as a social phenomenon, but in relation to online profiles and the people behind those profiles. And sort of why are we here, or why is this interesting from a hacker perspective? Um, well, for us it's kind of easy. It's basically about social hacking. We come from an engineering background and then kind of ended up a little bit in sociology while doing this. And we really think that social hacking is something that is really relevant and becomes more and more relevant over the next few years. I'll talk a bit more about it. But the idea is just that, like, the tools that we've all been using for a long time, technological tools that we've been
Yeah, I
hacking,
think that's what we need.
have, of course,
No,
become
no,
really
you're fine.
widespread,
That,
ended up in the
that's
hands
fine.
of just about
It's
everybody.
okay?
Um, and people aren't just using it as sort of set devices. They're, of course, using them in loads of different geographical settings. We have technology that's always present within our offline social life or within our regular social encounters. Um, we also have a lot of technology that's becoming more and more immersive, people putting more and more of themselves into the technology that they're using, and really, in some sense, transferring a bit of themselves to something external, something technology-based. And also, it's of course not just about connecting lots of different technological devices to be able to communicate, but we also use them when we're close to each other to be a kind of distributed cognition aid or something while we're actually interacting with others. And um, in relation to the internet or online spaces, there's a really interesting aspect of everybody starting to use this all the time, because kind of the internet as a medium containing profiles, representations of people, end up being um, a sort of a mass market medium where all people actually kind of end up being within the medium. Like present something of yourself on a profile online, and it's something that shifts a bit of you into the medium itself. So people are in regular social settings and sort of discovering things about themselves using so much technology for this, and help using technology to construct themselves and construct the patterns of how they interact with other people. So in this sense then, we think that it's really interesting to start looking at how we can understand sociology or social behavior within these technological environments, um, and then start to think about sort of social hacking. What fun can we do with that, and what how can we manipulate social behavior and such. And of course, then we feel that there's a whole lot of things that have to be kind of researched and thought about and written about, but basically everything about what it means to be a social creature within these new environments. Our focus has been on one part, then on trust, which seems simple enough. I mean, trust, it's one concept, but it's quite soon you realize that it's it's a concept that's very hard to define what it is. Some of you may have been working with different trust applications or something like that, and you realize quite fast that it's very hard to create these applications because trust takes on so many different forms within our everyday life. Um, I mean, if you think about just how we use the word, I would say that trust is something. For instance, I trust the Visa system when I pay with my Visa card, that the money will get drawn in the right way. But on a completely different setting, I also trust my mother or a close friend when she or he tells me a secret. So both these things are trust, but they're quite different. And in an academic setting, there's a whole multitude of names for different types of trust. And we're not going to go through all of them today. We're going to make a basic distinction that makes it a bit easier to think about trust in online settings. But it's good to keep in mind that as an important social phenomenon, it's also something that's very complex and hard to grasp and very hard to define exactly what it is.
So, does this actually work? Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. So the first question here that we should ask, or that we could ask at this point, is why do we need trust at all? Well, instead of answering that directly, I'm going to show you a picture here. This is a lonely guy in a white box. It's a very kind of unnatural situation. And what's happened here is that this guy in the corner has lost the ability of trusting. So he's just paralyzed. He can't do anything. I mean, without trust, it's impossible to act in the world. If you don't trust the people around you, laws of physics and computers, technology, stuff that you have to deal with on an everyday basis, you can't do anything. Um, but that's a very strange situation. The other extreme here would be if you were to be a superhuman kind of creature, flying over the earth, being able to predict the future, knowing all the state of affairs in the world at all times. There wouldn't be a need for trust then at all. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It is. And so trust here is really this balance between knowledge and ignorance. It's really being human and being somewhere in between that continuum. Um, so this is Shibuya Crossing in 2007. It's a pretty busy place, and this is really increasingly how the world is looking. It's a lot of communication going on, a lot of interactions. The world, for me, I just feel it on a personal level, it's becoming increasingly complex. And all this technology, communications technology, is actually making my social life very much more complex and intense than it used to be before. I'm a junkie for all these social networks and all the new software that's becoming increasingly prevalent in our lives. But the interesting thing here with trust is that it reduces complexity. It's really this key factor that enables me to focus on the things that are important and enables me as a person, as a human being, to ignore and reduce the cognitive load on my brain. Because if you trust the systems around you, if you trust the people, if you trust a lot of relationships and all that, it really enables you to focus. So today we can't really go through all the different trust forms and all the different types of trust and ways of looking at it, but we can say something about trust and how you could look at it, and especially as a designer or as an architect of these new services, some of these frameworks can actually be very helpful. And this is one of the things that it's a pretty trivial in a sense, trivial way of looking at it. It's basically you have a big continuum, you have calculus based on the one hand, and you have identification based trust on the other hand. So it's called calculus based trust, CBT, and IBT on the other side. Basically, calculus based trust is really it's almost not trust at all. It's just bringing the rational man inside of us to the surface. It's really about making a swift calculation or a swift assessment in a particular type of situation. So say you're buying a car, a used car on in a shady place, and you want to just get out of there with the car. So you basically have to just assess the situation very quickly and decide whether you want to buy the car for that price or not. So yeah, maybe you go in there and you buy the car, and then what's on the other side of the spectrum is really when you start identifying with people and when you start really building these long-lasting relationships. And there, the kind of core factor is identification. So you start knowing a lot more about the person on the other side, or the actor or the system. And so continuing the car example, say you go back there next year to buy another car or to do some other business with this shady guy. Maybe you start identifying with the guy for some reason. Maybe you start doing more business with him. Then you have this other type of relationship going, and that's sort of the real deeper form of more human trust that's emerging. So you have this continuum, and yeah.
Hello? Okay, thanks. Um, so if we start just thinking about these the two basic trust forms, um, we can start looking at one situation where trust is really important, and it's the case when we're trying to establish trust with a new person, somebody you don't know previously. You're establishing some kind of new relation, and you have to kind of assess this person. A good way of connecting this to the profiles and how things work online is to think of a system that you create. Like when you're creating a profile for users within your system, think about the different expressions that they have. What tools the users have to express their personality. And I think that a good main and basic distinction about these personal expressions is to look at explicit and implicit things you say about yourself. It's a pretty old distinction in sociology, but it tends to be quite good in a lot of different ways. And connecting to the different trust forms, it's not quite that simple, but quite often that the more explicit a person expresses themselves, the closer at hand there will be for CBT or calculus-based trust establishment. Whereas when you say things implicitly about yourselves, maybe by things you do rather than clear statements, that leaves it a bit more open and makes it more open for people to identify with you and establish this other type of trust that's a bit stronger. So also, if we are creating systems or designing platforms or online spaces where people are to socialize, we have to think about then, okay, how the system we are designing, how much does that control the user's actions? Or do we want to be very controlling and say that people have to be very explicit, or are we completely say that people have to be implicit about things, or how do we do that? An example would be this kind of personal representation. A Rapleaf badge. Rapleaf is a company in San Francisco making portable reputation scores. It's similar to the eBay rating, but it's taken out of eBay, so you can actually use it on multiple sites or in emails or things like that. It's a system behind it, of course, that depending on how people rate and stuff, you get a score. that is then used to present yourself to somebody else in another setting. And of course, in this scenario, the system kind of does everything. It forces people to be very explicit, and the actual representation of a person ends up being this very clear-cut score that basically says, in this case, that it's a trustworthy person. Um, this of course makes it really easy for somebody to establish a calculus-based trust relationship, but as Eric said, that's usually something that comes fast and is not so strong and maybe not that long-lasting. Um, on the other hand, if we look at like this instead, which of course there's no real system or anything guiding people or behind it. I mean, Mahir here has hacked together some HTML one evening. Um, this really doesn't, the system behind this doesn't do anything for him and his personal expression. It's been completely open for him to describe himself however he wants. The point with this is that not only is he not saying that much explicit, but all the choices he's made here and what he decides to have, like the background, everything like that, is actually saying something about him as a person. Um, Whereas in the Repleaf thing, it's very hard to get a sense of the person behind it. So even though this doesn't have a numeric or anything you can clearly and rationally calculate, you might have a feeling of identification through the style that he's done this, or the clothes that he's wearing, or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways of how these expressions take place, depending on what the system allows somebody to do. Um, and if we continue a bit with this kind of a framework of thinking about things, we can have a look at, for instance, the basic Flickr photo stream. Um, for me, because this is obviously just the photos that comes on somebody's stream, but they're also a representation of the person holding the account. So in a sense, this is a profile that says something about a person. And for me, when seeing this representation, I feel an instant connection, which is not so strange because these are pictures of our previous office and things that were very close to me. There's nothing really explicit being said in this, of course, but there's still something in it that makes me feel a deep connection to it. That also closely then relates to the type of relationship I would establish with the person holding this profile. So the trust form here would then be this identification-based type, which is fuzzier but usually a bit stronger because this is something connected to kind of my life in a deeper sense. And then, of course, on the other hand, on the other side of the scale, um, it's kind of the classic example of the eBay profile, similar to the Rapleaf profile, but of course, with all these numbers and stuff that we have here to represent the person, it becomes very explicit and easy to make a judgment. But the interesting thing about it is that this also kind of sets the tone and character for the rest of the social behavior within this site. If you look at, for instance, the comments on this eBay page, it's all very like quick, formal, pragmatic, to the point. It's completely in line with having having a social setting that's based upon this calculus-based trust, where there's nothing really being said about the individual behind it more than about the pragmatic facts that you need to get something done. If we, of course, these two examples are kind of extreme, but most websites look like something completely different, or most personal representations, and they combine a lot of different things, certain things that are very explicit, certain things that are very implicit. So just as Eric said, with the continuum between the two different trust forms, it ends up being, of course, a shift between these types of trust forms in different elements of the site. But there will usually be a kind of overall social order of the general trust form within that. But a lot of sites can be hard to understand exactly what that type of trust is. Another really important aspect of trust is how it is something that we use to maintain relationships, or um, how we in social settings try and remain, or we try and maintain trust between people. The previous things were much about sort of getting trust for somebody. Um, there's quite a lot of important things about social interaction with this just need to maintain trust and maintain relationships. And kind of an interesting example of how this can be a little different than you maybe sometimes initially think is to think about how a sort of a certain sense of social ambiguity can be introduced by the architecture of the social space. And it's a very easy point, but an example would kind of be this. Um, so say that somebody's talking on the phone. Maybe like I call up a friend or something like that, and I just want to have a brief chat. But then something else while I'm on the phone starts occupying me. So I want to get out of this phone call, but I don't want to tell the person on the other line that, hey, I don't want to talk to you anymore. So they need some kind of way of getting out of the phone call to be able to do what I want to do, but I don't want to be rude um, and introduce some kind of like potential conflict into the relationship. And people use these kind of schemes of getting around social awkwardness all the time. Teenagers are really good in this example. They always just say that their cash card is running low, they don't have any more money, and they have to hang up. Totally socially accepted, no problem. You can just hang up the phone, and nobody will think that there's anything strange about it. And the interesting thing is also that usually it doesn't matter if the person on the other end believes this or not. It's just that it's kind of a compromise. It's an agreement of, or it's a tacit agreement where you don't have to actually um, say something, but you can still agree on some common grounds. And what this tries to illustrate is basically that limits within a system that creates a social space, of course, will always act as limitations, like in the sense that you don't have any money on your phone card, you can't make any phone calls. But they have additional features to them as well, in this case acting as a kind of enabler. This limitation in how people can use the system becomes a kind of social resource in the example given. Um, in the way that they just take kind of the blame for things where we don't want to get too nitty-gritty about details in our relationships. So basically, these type of hard system limits can be something that actually helps people maintain trust and maintain relationships within the social settings.
We found very useful in our research. That is the concept of performativity, and that's a contrast to something that is descriptive. So it's something that performs something, and it's different from just describing. And the notion of performativity, or the concept itself, has its roots in speech act theory, which is a kind of obscure field in sociology. And the original context in which this term was used was when talking about the power of words and the power of language, in the sense that language describes, but it also performs. So language can actually change the state of affairs in the world. There has been stuff written in many fields, subfields within sociology, that uses this terminology of performativity, uses these concepts. For example, there's been a lot written about programming languages and inherent performativity in programming, and how that can kind of shape the world. The example I would like to talk about now is one, well, it was the concept that's been used in economic sociology, and to talk about the stock exchange, for example, about economics in general. So Michel Calon is a French philosopher or a sociologist who has talked about this, and basically posed the question, or he said that economists should stop worrying about which models are best at predicting the future and um, describing the world, and instead pose the question: how do these models and how does the language of economics affect the way we act and the way the markets work and the way yeah, basically whole society works. So there's inherent power in economics and these models and representations within it. One of the researches that was done by fairly recently by some colleagues of Michel Calon in this field was on the Chicago Stock Exchange. And what happened there was that it's a stock options exchange, and in the 1970s, this market, this stock exchange, or regarding options, was very chaotic. There was a highly volatile market where you couldn't really predict anything. You could make, huge profits if you were just, smart and talk to people, but there was no kind of objective way of predicting the price of a stock option. I'm not going to go into details here, but basically what happened was that sometime in the 70s, there was a little team of analysts and researchers that came up with a formula. It was just kind of a draft formula that could predict the price of stock options. And so the distributed papers on the stock options exchange with basically the result of the formula. So you had the price today, and you could see the price in the future, basically, or in a few weeks' time. And they distributed these papers, and in the beginning, the predictions were horrible, so they couldn't predict the price at all. And but there was kind of a point where they had a critical mass of people having the formula, and they actually changed the formula as well. So they changed around the numbers quite a bit. And eventually, prices started to stabilize around the price that was given by the formula. So the reality that was kind of predicted by the formula, or at least the vision that was inherent in the formula, became the reality. So it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this happened over the course of maybe 10, 20 years. And now this formula is the Black-Scholes formula. They got the Nobel Prize in '97, I think. And it's absolutely ubiquitous in stock options exchanges everywhere. It's basically driving the stock exchange. Essentially, it's incorporated into all these systems, and all the analyst institutes have huge computers running this formula over and over and over again. And I think it's still mutating, it's still changing slightly, but it's kind of stabilized. So the interesting thing here is really that the formula is not just describing reality, but it's actually shaping reality. It's changing reality and the practices of people in that reality. So it's an engine and not a camera, is their conclusion in this research. And basically, the analogy here that we're using is that when we put ourselves online, when we put our identities in these profiles, in these representations and models of ourselves online as fragments, like this, I mean, me myself, as I said, I'm quite a junkie when it comes to these things. I probably have hundreds of profiles just laying around on the internet describing me as a person. And the question we could ask here is really, how much am I affecting these profiles? How much is description, and how much is actually a performance that is continuous performance that's happening through these profiles? So not only, I would argue, are we or me, I'm performing my own representations, but these representations are increasingly performing me as a person, my own identity. So the obvious question here then would be, how can these profiles and these representations, models, ideas of a reality that might not yet be true, change the way we think about trust and change the way we think of these basic notions, human notions. So here are just a few examples of these representations. Again, there are probably hundreds more competing out there for the future, or for our mindsets, basically. So they're obviously good for different things. And basically, the interesting thing is that they can become these self-fulfilling prophecies. Basically, they dictate the reality that is not yet true, but if enough people, if they reach critical mass, people start thinking in terms of, how can I increase my eBay score? How can people perceive me as trustworthy by me imitating the underlying logic of this system?
Okay. So what what do this mean for architects or designers or hackers or creators of any of these kind of um, uh, technical spaces that act as a social space? Well, I think one of the main things that we have to sort of think a lot about is that all these little sort of tiny decisions um, have quite a large importance. If we're talking about how people represent themselves online, changing the very notion of how we perceive trust in both online and offline settings, which we believe it is, then it's something that's quite important for humans within the future. So what we think then is, of course, that there needs to be a lot more people getting into using social theory and applying it to technical spaces. So we kind of get away from this basic Web 2.0 idea of, just slapping on a share button to something or just slapping on a rate this button and it turns into social software. We would argue that social software really and being able to create good social spaces technically is in some ways about being sensitive. It's about having a lot of knowledge for just as you have to be sensitive and have a lot of knowledge about choosing the right technology for something you're building, you have to have a lot of knowledge and be sensitive about choosing the right type of social strategy or idea for social behavior within that space. So, and an idea that illustrates that it's maybe not always the the simplest solution or maybe even the most obvious solution that's right is I think a good one if we look at this guy, Jimmy Wales from the Wikipedia Foundation, and what's been happening, of course, I mean, everybody uses Wikipedia and so, but um, I think Jimmy Wales is, in this sense, a really sensitive guy to both how the technology works, but also how people work on a social level. Because, I mean, there's been a lot of critique about Wikipedia in many different ways, but specifically, I think there's been a lot of people kind of attacking Jimmy Wales specifically about and arguing that, well, Wikipedia should implement some kind of reputation system, some kind of social accounting system, or something like this. Some kind of technology that makes it easier for people to make fast trustworthiness assessments. And Jimmy Wales, on the other hand, has been really hesitant, saying like, no, this is not what we should do. It works better in the way that it is now, and any kind of introduction of these kinds of more hardcore reputation systems, as good as they might be in other cases, is not going to work for our website. And I think, like, Jimmy Wales is perfectly right in this specific setting, because if we think about how Wikipedians kind of work today, it's a lot more. We would argue that it's a lot more identification-based trust between the people at Wikipedia. You have a lot more identification by the work you've done together in this collaborative setting over time than that you just assess somebody quick on their profile. So that then ends up shaping the whole social order and culture within this place. And the risk then would be that introducing just a simple rating system or something like that would imply that there's a more there's a norm of this calculus-based trust instead, that it's a lot more about rational assessments of each other, which in extension then implies a completely different social order, and one that usually clashes with the ideas of collaboration and community. And I mean, we all know that the basis of Wikipedia is quite closely related to a lot of behavioral traits associated with community as well. So I think it's a pretty good example of how, in a certain case, it's good to leave things a little bit more open for a certain trust form, or leave things open so that another trust form is established. Um, but yeah, so and I think Jimmy Wells is in the end probably pretty right, in that it wouldn't be good for Wikipedia to introduce these kinds of social accounting systems there.
So wrapping up here, we can kind of conclude that we have different trust forms, of which we've only talked about a few today. We have different ways of influencing that trust as social society, mind hackers, or architects, designers of these social spaces. And one of the things that's really important, that's kind of interesting in our research or the stuff that we've been studying a lot, are these profiles, and the fact that they're performative and really shape people's behaviors, and um, yeah, and how kind of the future is being shaped. And these different architectures and these different trust forms, they lead to different behaviors on the individual level, um, and that's very, very interesting and kind of, yeah, clear when you observe these communities. Different trust forms are good for different things, which the Wikipedia example, for example, shows quite well. They have one thing in common, all these trust forms, and they're still about trust. And in that regard, they reduce the social complexity. And this is what Niklas Luhmann, who is a sociologist, German sociologist, concluded in his book on the subject. Um, Trust enables collaboration, participation. And getting these architectures is really, really hard. Um, Being sensitive is key. Yeah, social hacking is really hard, we think. It's not rocket science. It's not entirely trivial, but it's tricky, and we're at the beginning of understanding on a deeper level how this works. So thank you.